First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to everybody for coming, because I know we had to reschedule because I was poorly. So thank you very much for that. And I'm really, really excited to see so many people here to talk about this subject, because I think it's a really important one, especially in light of COVID. And I hope that anything that I sort of speak about today you find really helpful, and please do, I'd love to hear from you afterwards and everything else. So I'm looking forward to all of your questions, so don't be afraid to ask. So basically this is just a bit of a recap on the first part of my research and the presentation that I did, that hopefully you've all watched, which was the recorded one. I just wanted to just do a bit of a recap, just in case you watched it a while ago and we didn't quite get around to watching it. So basically this all started when my students came back from their second lockdown in March, and I looked at a sea of year 7s who had been lively and bubbly and ready to give me the right answers, to a sea of students who looked very disengaged, very nervous, and had appeared to lost quite a lot of their knowledge. And it was such a stark difference that I just thought, what is going on? And I spoke to a colleague and I said, it's almost like they're traumatized. And they said, oh, no, don't worry, Suzi. Students, but children bounce back. It's a really big word. And that's sort of how it began. So just in terms of what trauma is, I think a lot of people think about trauma as being an event, and it can be caused by an event. But it is actually the way we react to that event and the social, the emotional and psychological and physiological residue that's left over from that heightened period of stress. And that comes from experiences of threat, violence, and life-challenging events. And if we think about that in the context of COVID, there was a definite threat and a definite threat to life. And there was definitely life-challenging events. And whether that happened on a large scale for people, or maybe they didn't feel as affected at the time, I know that there has been an impact on everyone that I speak to, and it's very evident in the classroom. So how do we know, how can we measure if a child is potentially traumatized? The only way that this is currently the only current scale we have is the ACEs scale, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences scale. And they are 11 markers for ACEs. They are common. And it's thought that, almost over two-thirds of the UK population are thought to experience one ACE, and that was before the pandemic. And 10% have more than 4 or more. And if you think about 10%, that's 3 children in every classroom of 30 at least. And the pandemic not only made ACEs occurring more likely, but it is also thought that they would be categorised as an ACE in the future. And there's other things that are missing from the scale that now I think we'd probably like to add in there in a sort of our present world, as the study is quite old. So sort of 30 years on, there's probably likely to be more ACEs added to that list as well. This has a massive knock-on effect. The difference between no ACEs versus 4+ ACEs, you can see the increase in likelihood. So this isn't a certainty, and it's really, really, really important to stress that just having an ACE isn't a certainty that a child will be struggling with a traumatic response, but it is an indication. So who basically collated a lot of ACEs studies together. So this is over 2,500 participants from separate studies that were all combined together, and they sort of collated that 4 times, just under 4 times as likely to struggle with anxiety, victimization, suicide attempts are really big in terms of just how choices and how stress affects the body and sort of everything else. So you can see that is a really, really concerning set of statistics. But then when you look at the fact that actually we look at trauma, and I think a lot of people think trauma, oh, something terrible must have happened. There must have been an absolutely life-altering event like the loss of someone or a really, really, really big event to happen. And that is true. And it's what weirdly is called a simple trauma, because it's just a one-off event. A complex trauma is something that happens over time. And there's more of a sense of blame connected to a complex trauma. Simple trauma, there's no real blame there, and it's just, and there's obviously and also a lot more support. So everyone collects around that person, and I've experienced that very recently. I lost somebody very close to me recently, and the support that I had was absolutely amazing, and I couldn't have got through that time without them. However, there were things happening before that actually sort of went under the radar, and this is where complex trauma comes in. A simple trauma can turn into a complex trauma if things happen as a result of that. So if there's a loss of a loved one and then they have to move, moving away from their social circle, moving schools, etc., but that knock-on effect can then become a complex trauma. So that's just a bit of an understanding about how we look at trauma. And I spoke to a great lady who sort of categorized it as big T trauma and little t traumas, and the little traumas that we don't pick up are fundamental. And I always say the way that I've sort of looked at this and given it an analogy is that the obvious trauma, you'd look at a child carrying a boulder and you'd rush to help them or break it down and take it for them. And a complex trauma would be like seeing a child looking quite low and quite heavy, or maybe not even at all, maybe just walking, but and you ask them to open their hand and they've got pebbles in their hand, but then you realise they're also in their pockets and their rucksack, and they're carrying the same weight. They've just collected it over time, and it's caused a similar, if not more damaging effect. Why this is important for teachers is it has an overwhelming impact on the ability of a child to learn, and this comes in two phases. This comes because of struggles to do with regulation, and it comes with struggles to do with memory. The regulation things is the things that I talked about in the first part of the seminar, and the memory is the second bit that we're going to talk about today, although I do touch on regulation as well. So the impact on ACEs in education, this was the bit that I was really scared about when I saw it, and I thought these statistics are really quite concerning. So no ACEs, nearly 97% of children had no learning or behaviour difficulties. 4 or more ACEs, over 50% more likely to have SEND needs and learning needs, 32 times more likely to have behaviour problems. That's huge. And if you think about the fact that the pandemic also made ACEs more likely, now when we come back into schools and we can see the issues with regulation and we can see the behaviours that are coming out of some of our students, and that is across the board. I've spoken to a lot of teachers in a lot of schools and we're all feeling in a similar way. This really backs this evidence. So in terms of looking forward, my screen has done the same thing. We will get there. We will get there. I think it was upset by the fire alarm. And why this is important now is the knock-on effect of these issues, this spaced period of time that students were out of school. There's also evidence that the younger the trauma happens, the more, the deeper the tracks of damage, and the more impact it will have on students, which is why I think we are starting to see more issues in Key Stage 3 and lower years. We've seen that actually their habits aren't there, that they're not used to sitting in classrooms for long periods of time, all those types of things. So not only do I think that actually the focus for work like the work I've been doing needs to be on Key Stage 3 primarily, but also students will have less considerations for exams as time goes on. The foundation and the habits they learn in these years will not be as solidified, but also, and the thing that I spoke about in the first part of the seminar in terms of risk taking and not wanting to take risks because of being quite hyper vigilant, this is the time for them to fail in a more low stakes environment. We don't need to worry about GCSEs yet. We don't need to worry about exams yet. So Key Stage 3 is the time to actually really focus on this structure, focus on how we can support our children to learn so that they do have these habits moving forward into Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, and they do feel supported. So in terms of learning, there's 3 things that really impact a child that is struggling with trauma: a sense of safety, feelings of connectedness, and feelings of hope. And in terms of, if you apply this to learning, Students, I think if you spoke to any child, they would say to you that learning is risky. They don't want to put their hand up for fear of getting it wrong. They don't want to get it wrong. The amount of times students, when they've made a mistake, have apologized to me, and I've gone, it really does not matter. It's what I've emblazoned my wall in the communal space of design and technology, and it says where we celebrate mistakes, because we do. So if they're feeling hypervigilant, they're going to want to take even less risks. And when we think of learning as a risk, that is an issue. They're also going to struggle with feeling connected to peers and to adults. And that is going to impact how they feel at school, but it's also going to impact their executive function. So their cognition, their behavior regulation, that is also that's really going to be an issue. And then feelings of hope. What's the point? What is the point in learning this? There's no point. And also not feeling confident to do things they previously could do. I definitely have seen that with students that I've known, and then they've come back and they've been quite shaky at things that I knew they were really confident in. So I think it's those three things is things that we need to consider when we consider also the impact on memory. That is the biggest thing. If you think a child cannot learn, cannot remember when they're in a hypervigilant state, if they're not connected to the people in the classroom, they're not necessarily going to be listening or wanting to engage in what you're talking about. And then if they see that actually if they feel like there's no point, they're not going to want to remember either. So that is really sort of the key crux of why it's not just one reason. There's a few. And then the other part is that developmental trauma can have an impact on brain development. So especially when a child is younger, as I said, and it's in developmental immaturity, it leaves deeper tracks of damage. So it's not only that they can't access the learning because of these three things, but also they may physically not be able to remember and learn in the same way. There's a lot of different research out there to tell you how trauma impacts memory, and the different types of memory. So it can really affect your ability to remember things in sequential order. It can really affect your ability to remember how to do things. So things you really once felt confident on, especially if there's an element of risk there. So this example with procedural memory is a bike, but if we think about food and nutrition using an oven, there's an element of risk there. That's going to be a concern. And that also happens with emotional memory, where they're triggered by something. And if there was something to do with whatever you're saying in the lesson, whatever's happened at break time, whatever's happened first thing in the morning, that re-triggers re-traumatization, something that has happened previously, they're not going to be able to learn. They're not going to remember things in the same way. So then there's lots of research on it, but there's not really a lot to tell you what to do about it. And that's the bit that I sort of try to really get to grips with. So in terms of what can we do about it? So there's sort of four things at play here. There's a lot of research on reducing risk and things that I spoke about in the first part of the seminar in terms of how we phrase things to students, how we welcome them into the classroom. Also, feelings of hope. I talked about small wins, and I'll talk about small wins again today because I think that's really important. We can foster support. There's not a lot to do with how we support memory making. So I sort of had to go back out into research and then pull some things together that I thought may fit and may reduce the risk of learning. So in terms of how memory works, so this is really important to highlight and for us to remember that we've got very used to comparing our memory to a computer because it's the only real thing we have that is tangible for us to say, oh, that's how it works. You store something in a file and then you come back to retrieve it and it's there and it's logical and it all makes sense and that's great. That's not how memory works at all, but it's the only thing we have that is similar. But memory works in a network of webs where we connect knowledge together. So this is important for us to remember first off in terms of if students were learning at a time where they were in a hypervigilant state, where they were struggling with a traumatic response, where something traumatic had happened to them, not only have they potentially not remembered, if they have, it may also be connected to that point in time. So that is something to be really mindful of. The second thing is that these knowledge webs don't happen overnight. They take time, and the knowledge is connected in ways that we won't necessarily think it will be connected. And this can also be a very positive thing, which I will talk to you about later. So this is what we need to encourage. We need to encourage these memory webs, these memory maps to form, rather than just thinking, I've spoken to them about it, I've taught them, then we're going to move on. So in terms of moving forward, I realized that we had to really start at the bottom and look at the curriculum. So in terms of, this is sort of what I deemed in terms of actually what we're just seeing is the top bit. We're just seeing stage 3. We're just seeing the fact that they can't remember. But underneath that, there's a lot of things that we need to put in place to make sure that that child can remember in the classroom. So we need to start with a curriculum review. Does our curriculum adequately link knowledge together to allow children to access that learning and access a framework that can link it together? Do we also have an environment that's safe for students to learn? So if we're finding learning risky, what are we doing to reduce the risk of learning in our classrooms? And then we get to the retention and recall bit right at the top. So how do we link knowledge together? If they don't have adequate strategies to help them retain and recall knowledge, how can we do that for them? And why this is really important, and it's not to replace external one-to-one help. This is not to replace students who really do need help from professionals. That is really, really important. They get that support and they get that help. But when they come into the classroom, we want them to be able to, even if it's just nuggets of information, or feel safe in our classroom. That's what we want to do. So the first thing is that we needed to think about how they entered the classroom. So I would start always with a memory recall task. And then I realized that actually, if a child hasn't been in, and also if we think about the level of absence we currently have at the moment and the level of attendance, that's bigger than before. I don't think I've actually taught a full class of students. It's a one-off now. It's not the norm anymore. So these knowledge gaps that students have, if I'm starting with a retrieval of something they don't know, that's instantly going to potentially trigger a hypervigilant state. I don't know what to do. I'm starting to panic. That's going to make my classroom feel risky. So what I started to do was have an entry activity that I gave them at the door, and that actually they could get on with straight away. And I saw really boisterous classes literally sit down, get very excited about what picture they had to colour in, and start colouring in anything they liked, even highlighters, which I don't usually let them do. They could draw me a picture, so there was an element of choice. So there was an element of control for them in terms of, this isn't out of my control. I can control what I do for the first few minutes of the lesson, or they can tell me something about their day. This was really powerful because it gave me insights into students that I would never have known before. I ended up having conversations with students about their dog that I didn't know about, and all sorts of different things that were really, really exciting, and fostered that connectedness with those students when I took their books in to mark them. And then what that allowed is a small win. So collecting the small wins, how can we help them to feel confident throughout the lesson? Well, actually, I've come in, I've sat down, and I quite like the colouring in that I've done while Mrs. done the register. So it's nothing, there's no risk here. And it also allows time for them to think about the fact that they need their homework and their pencil cases and all that kind of thing. And I would generally, about a minute in, drop in what the do now would be, just verbally. So in a couple of minutes, everybody, we're going to be thinking about what we did last lesson. So just start to think about what maybe you remember. And we're also going to be really specific when we think about the grill, just to let you know. And then that gives them some forewarning and allow time to really digest that task. Then for the do now, the memory retrieval, I could then circulate the room because I wasn't concerned with who didn't have a pen and everybody else. So I could go to the ones that weren't there last lesson, or I could go to the ones that I could see potentially were looking not sure and hadn't written anything, and really talk to them about what the issue was, which was also a really powerful thing to do. This built into having explicit examples, and the reason why I've got a bigger version of it here, I put knowledge organisers. So in our school, we're actually in the process of developing knowledge organisers for Key Stage 3 this year, but we hadn't had them. And what's great about a knowledge organiser is it's all of the key knowledge for that module on a page. And I know that Francis is going to put some links to some really excellent ones that you could use for your students. But what I could say then is, okay, if we're not sure and we weren't here, you're going to use a different colour pen, and we're going to use our knowledge organiser to support this this retrieval. So I'm lowering the risk again of, if I don't know, Mrs. said it's fine if I use it, I'm just going to use a different colour pen. That can be quite standard across a lot of schools. There might be some of you saying, absolutely, we do that already. Fantastic, brilliant. But that's a really lovely way of them feeling supported. And when I spoke to students about the implementations, about the interventions I put in place in the classroom, this was the one that said, everything else feels like a test. Everything else feels like you're trying to get information out of me. This feels like help. And I found that phrase really powerful. This feels like help, which was really great. There's a lot of things in here. There was a lot of research that went into this about how it's formulated and coloured boxes and all that kind of thing, which I'm happy to talk to people about later if they want to. But having a white background is really important so that we can photocopy it in coloured paper for students with different visual stress requirements and things like that. And they can also highlight and write notes all over it as well. The other explicit examples that I used were students in the classroom. I spoke to students, and there's a lot of research about actually asking a teacher, asking an adult is a risk. Asking your friend is not a risk. And actually, if I can highlight a couple of people in the room that I know their stuff, actually, I'm going to go and ask them. And this was a really powerful thing. Not only was it great for the students that had, and I call them golden aprons, not only was it great for those students, but it was great for the class as a whole. I watched students interact with each other, and I watched them have conversations. I watched students I never thought would explain something so eloquently or have the patience to explain, do a really wonderful job of supporting each other. What I realized was actually one person is quite isolating. So I then had two, and I had two people in the classroom so that they could talk to each other as well. And I would say, sometimes I would say, right, I'm going to put you in charge of X today. Is that okay? Can you work together? And that worked really well as well. So that use of, and then they felt supported too. So that use of who else can I go to for help was really important. And then about reducing the risk of new learning. So we can reduce the risk of retrieval. We can reduce the risk of asking for help. But how do we reduce the risk of new learning? And actually, the way I did this was to try and link and make links with their memory as well. So encouraging that knowledge web to build. What do we already know that can help us? Because if we already know half of it or a third of it, suddenly the brand new task that Miss is talking about doesn't seem so risky because she's just told me that I already know some of it. So actually, the big task doesn't seem so big anymore. So this was really great in terms of, we were talking about using the oven when we previously used the grill. So we talked about the fact that we already knew the symbol for the grill. So when we come to find the one for the oven, we knew it wasn't the symbol for the grill. We talked about the fact that we already knew all of the health and safety to do with using the oven, what we needed to wear on our oven gloves and where our hair needs to be, and not bending down in front of the oven, and working as a team to open the door and all of that great stuff. So they already knew that. They already knew that there were two separate dials, one that controlled the temperature and one that controlled the function. We talked about that. And then suddenly this, okay, we're using the oven today, that seems separate from using the grill, is combined together. So not only am I encouraging those knowledge webs to form, am I encouraging that old knowledge to link to new, but I am also then reducing the risk of this new learning taking place, which was really important. We then followed up with an evaluation. And this has come from a lot of metacognitive research in terms of how we really support our students to learn, but then being really reflective. And this also was really helpful. The question is, what knowledge check? Is there anything I still don't understand? Because I've put my golden aprons in place. We've got our knowledge organizer that's got some of the key information. So for example, I built in some practical things to do with the settings for the oven. But there also is going to be students that still aren't quite sure of what they're doing. And they're not going to be students that want to tell you. They might tell you. But again, if we're thinking about a risk, I don't want to tell Miss in front of everybody, and I don't want to stay behind and tell Miss that I'm still not sure on what we've been doing all lesson is something that I still don't know. So let's put it in the reflection as well. Is there still anything I don't understand? And a lot of students said, no, I understand. It's great. But a few students did say, I'm still not sure on this bit. And actually, that was really important, because then I could take the books in. When I took the books in and we came back to our next lesson, I could then say, right, okay, don't worry, we can go through this again. That's fine. Or I'm going to make sure that there's a golden apron wearer on that table to really support that student. So that was a really, really powerful thing. But building it into a reflection wasn't an immediate question, wasn't the only thing I was asking. And I was encouraging them to then start thinking independently, what skills from this task could I apply to something else? And what was really nice that started happening is that they're now starting to think cross-curricularly. So in the workshop, because I also teach design and technology, we were talking about something to do with maths. And one of the students said, oh, Miss, we do that in maths. And also, oh, Miss, we do that in science as well. So one of the things that I think a lot of us as secondary teachers really sort of want to foster is this cross-curricular. How can we get them to think cross-curricularly? And this was starting to happen the more I asked them the question, what do we already know? What do we already know? Where is that knowledge coming from? And these webs, how they've tied their knowledge together, actually they were starting to come up with things from other subjects, drawing that knowledge from other places, which was so, so, so lovely. There was also a way of how can I make this different? How can I make changes for next week? How can I change what I have done today to improve, which was really beneficial for some students who may not necessarily think about that independently. And it was a real opportunity for them to just reflect and take some time. And I did this sometimes as a plenary. I also did it sometimes as a homework, and I just collected it back in the following week. In terms of why is this still relevant now, when the big gap in learning, the big loss of learning happened over 2 years ago? Well, we've been in survival mode for quite a long time. We've been, let's just get through the year for quite a long time. It's still not, it's managed, but it's not gone. And there's still a lot of risk of re-traumatization. For example, the cost of living now. If a student had a family member on furlough, or somebody lost their job and there was less money in the household at this time, cost of living is going to potentially re-trigger that. Parents' lives are harder. We're trying really hard to make ends meet, and we're trying really hard to be at work, and we're fundamentally all as adults just that little bit more stressed. In regard to behaviour, children depend on adults for regulation. So if we're not regulated and we're finding it quite stressful, and work's quite stressful and home's quite stressful, they're going to have a harder time to regulate as well. CAM's waiting list is huge. And like I said to you, this is in no way to replace support for students who really are struggling, who really do need one-to-one support. But this is a way of making our classrooms safer for students who may feel, do you know what, today might not be a great day. Oh, actually, I've come in and all I've been asked to do is do a bit of colouring in. And oh, I can use my knowledge organiser to help me with the knowledge I wasn't sure of last week. And oh, that new bit of learning, well, I already know some of it already. So those children are the ones that we're really trying to support here. As I said, the younger events happen, the more impact we have. So we are going to be impacted by this for years to come as secondary teachers, because we have the influx from primary, and the younger it happens, and also the less those really, really, really important routines that they learn right at the beginning of primary weren't embedded. We know that there are a lot more disaffected students. We know that attendance is an issue. So more lessons are lost. Also, more lessons are lost to intervention. More lessons are lost because of strike days. All of these things, there's more knowledge to catch up on. They've lost this time of practicing habits, and we need to really make this as explicit as we possibly can. And it's really about a package of intervention around student learning. It's not about one singular thing that's going to help traumatized learners to remember. It's about having a classroom that is supportive. It's about having resources in place. And it's really about making those links really explicit for them. For food and nutrition, we know we want them to experiment. We know we want them to enjoy our classroom. Our classrooms can be quite tricky. They're already quite sensory overload, pots and pans moving everywhere, grills on, knives out, all of these things. It can be an overwhelming environment for students, especially if their struggle is to get in for the day and sit at a desk. We don't do that. So we need to be even more aware of how that can affect a child that is potentially struggling with a traumatic response. The other thing that is really crucial is that we allow planning for error. So when we're building our schemes of work, we are allowing time to go back and recap. And this is hard when there is so much to cover, and we know that. But what I've encouraged my team to do is we have 12 lesson rotations at Key Stage 3. Let's make them 10, or let's make them 11. Give that breathing space of a lesson, so that actually if lessons 2 and 3 take lessons 2, 3 and 4, that's fine. If we've got knowledge that we need to catch up on because a lot of students aren't sure, we've got the time to do that without racing ahead. That does come with the question of what do we cut out? And that's a hard call, but actually allowing time in a scheme of work to recap and making sure that knowledge is really cemented and it's really well connected is really, really important. So really be mindful of that as well. That leads me to my top tips. My top tips for this sort of helping traumatized children with their knowledge and with their memory, making those links explicit. We think it's super obvious that if they've used the grill, they'll know how to use the oven because it's the same box with the same electrics and the same dials that they have to turn, just to a different function. But making that really explicit for them is really helpful. Encouraging methods of communication that help them say that they don't understand without having to say it in front of you or stay behind to talk to you. We're tall, we're a scary adult, we're the ones that give out warnings and everything else. So really, really thinking about how can they tell me that they're still not sure. That reflection time was really, really useful, and I found it really powerful. And it came from students that sometimes I would never imagine weren't sure because they look really confident in the classroom. And actually, underneath it all, a bit like us sometimes when we're winging it, they're winging it too. So giving them that chance to say that, I think, is really important. Have support for memory recall activities for those students to use if they're not sure, and how they communicate that with you so that you can pick up the knowledge, or when you take the books in, you know, oh, actually, everybody wasn't sure of that. That's the bit I need to recap in my planning for error time that I've allowed in my scheme of work. This is where I'm going to go back over that because actually they still don't know the 3 methods of heat transfer, and people aren't sure about which one's conduction and which one's convection. That's a really, really powerful thing. So I just use 2 different colour pens. It might be that you decide to do something different, but having those knowledge organisers to support that, or worksheets to help from last week, or whatever it is, I think is really helpful. And then using those knowledge organisers, if you're going to use knowledge organisers, they have to be embedded in your schemes of work and your lesson plans. So they can't just be something that's pulled out for revision. They have to be used regularly. They have to be referred to regularly, because actually, the more that we say it's in your knowledge organiser, look back at your knowledge organiser, they will independently do that. And I see students doing that now. When they're not sure, they just flip back, especially with spellings and keywords and things like that. I think that's also really important. So having that, their safety net, really, that help for modules, I think has been a real driving force. So that leads me to any questions. I hope that was useful. If I've sped over bits, please, by all means, ask me to repeat them.
Thank you, Suzi. That was absolutely brilliant. What we will do, if you don't mind, is that we'll move on to the next bit, which is about sort of the resources, and then we'll come back to you in a minute with any questions. One of the questions was about a bibliography, which I've just seen on your next slide. So that's great. So I can tick that one off my list. So if you wouldn't mind unsharing your presentation, and then I'll share mine. And if anybody's got any questions for Suzi, please do pop them in the chat box. Suzi might be able to answer them as we go along when I'm doing my little bit in a minute, or alternatively, we can come to them at the end. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, and hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, so Suzi talked about all some fantastic things that you can do in the classroom to really support your pupils' learning and memory. And I just thought I'd include some activities that we've got on Food, a Fact of Life that you might find useful to have a look at. So if you know our website, you'll know that we've got over 2,000 resources on the website to support teaching and learning around healthy eating, cooking, and where food comes from. And that's from 3 to 16. And we've got lots and lots of presentations, PowerPoint presentations. And for every one, we have a worksheet that goes alongside it. So you could use that for pupils to actually be able to demonstrate their knowledge. We've also got some other activities that will demonstrate previous learning, and some of them with images, which I think actually is quite an important thing, because that does help the pupils connect to what they've learned before. So, for example, we've got a picture there of a burger, and this follows on a burger making activity. So they can think, oh, yes, I can see it's a burger. I remember what we did in the burger lesson, and I can identify some of the things that are important about burger safety. There's other ones, things like tick lists that can be used as a visual stimulus, again, to remind the pupils. How many times do we tell them what the steps are for getting ready to cook? And you could have a big poster up on the wall that could remind them, or they could have a tick list. And that would be something that was just sort of keeping going on a regular basis to make sure that they're remembering this each time. Knowledge organisers. So I'm very, very glad that Suzi mentioned these. So we on the website have a knowledge organiser for every topic that we cover. And that is from primary right the way through to age 16. And our ones are quite well detailed, so they are editable. So you might find that perhaps there's too much detail in them for your pupils, or you might want to change them to suit your purpose. Or if it's 14 to 16, you might want to change it for your GCSE specification. But we've done them in the same way that Suzi did. So we've done them on a white background, but also we've done them the information is in separate boxes. So it can also be used as part of your schemes of work given to them at the beginning of your rotation or your lessons, pupils to use them regularly during the lesson. But equally, you could print them out and cut them up, and then pupils could use them as part of an activity, a matching activity, or an information finding activity. So lots and lots of different ways that they can be used. And as I said, there are lots on the website. And when we first introduced this, we thought we might get about 1,000 downloads. We've had over 100,000 downloads of these. So if you haven't seen them yet, recommend that you do. We've also got some thinking maps. If you're a thinking school, these can be quite useful for pupils to, again, to start thinking about their knowledge and getting it down on paper. And the ones I really like are the circle maps, because the pupils can just, in the sort of the outer circle, just put everything they know about a particular topic in there. And this is about dental health. And then around the outside, they talk about why is good dental health important. So first of all, just coming up with all the knowledge and then actually applying it. Flashcards I always think are just brilliant. We've got lots of different cards that on the website that you can use. And I was reading something the other day about double-sided flashcards. And so you've got two opportunities to actually test sort of memory and recall through that. Question cards and bingo. We've got a couple of bingo games which are quite fun to do with the pupils, and that gets them thinking about quite simple things about the names of fruit and vegetables and recognising those, or thinking about the different types of fruit and vegetables. But then we've got other ones to do with food hygiene, and lots of different images related to food hygiene, which have got some questions to go alongside them. So you could take it on to the next stage. We did some work actually recently for supporting pupils with additional needs, and we found through that providing stimulus materials for pupils was a really important thing, because they actually provide a point of recognition, but also a sort of a jumping off point for discussions. So, for example, this one here is all around the senses, and just having the images of the different parts of the body that relate to the senses was really useful for the pupils. But then also social stories as well. Those are, particularly for pupils with additional needs, can really help them understand the learning, but also transfer it from school to home, which I think is important. And Suzi was talking about cross-curricular links, but also it's important to have the links from what's happening in school to outside of school as well. And then there's posters. We all love a nice bright classroom, as long as it's not too distracting, of course, but to have some nice coloured posters on the wall, which again can be a point of discussion, is quite a nice thing. Low stakes testing. So Suzi was talking about Key Stage 3, particularly a point of time when you can do some things that are low stakes. Obviously, it gets a bit more difficult when you get to GCSE and you're starting to think about examinations. But some low stake testing, thinking about multiple choice online quizzes. They mark themselves, which is brilliant. We've got some quiz worksheets, and then Kahoot as well. If you're allowed to use phones in the classroom, Kahoot quizzes are great. Suzi's mentioned a couple of times about the recording that she did for us. So Suzi very kindly presented at our London conference, which was earlier on this year, and has then since recorded that presentation. And that is available on the website. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that yet, I would thoroughly recommend you do so, because it really forms a great basis for what Suzi's been talking about today. And then also we've got a couple of news articles that you might find interesting. One's about boosting pupil performance, but the other one is also about pupil performance and memory retrieval, with some really nice ideas of things that you can do in the classroom to help your pupils with that. Now, one thing I did want to mention before we finished, and this links in to Suzi saying about doing a curriculum audit or review. We tomorrow will be launching our new roadmaps, and we're really, really pleased with these. So we have put together a roadmap for healthy eating, cooking, and where food comes from, for what we feel should be the food nutrition education for pupils across the UK from 3 to 16 years. And it shows in a really nice visual way what pupils should learn and the sequence in which they should learn them. And we've got printable, downloadable versions, but we've also got interactive versions, which if you click on either a picture or the key fact, then you will then get taken to an area on the website, which will provide you with some more information for your teaching and learning and planning, but also some support for the pupils for independent learning. So the link, when you get the PowerPoint tomorrow, is in here, but also we'll be sending out some information via email over the next couple of days. So we hope that you find those useful. Quickly about keeping up to date. So we have our education news, we have a newsletter, we've got Twitter, we've also got an education email address. So do keep in touch with us and ask us if you've got any questions. We'd be very happy to help you with them. A little bit about more training. We're coming to the end of training for this year, live events like this, but we've got lots of online training, so do have a look at that. That's all free. And then, as I said right at the beginning, we'd be really grateful if you could complete an evaluation for us, and you should automatically be directed to this. If you're not, please don't worry, I will put it in an email tomorrow. So just quickly about questions. Suzi, have you seen any of as you've gone along?
I haven't seen any as I've gone along. I think I know that a couple of people were asking about the bibliography. That's fine. There's a bibliography on the presentation, but also if you wanted to drop me an email, I can drop my email into the chat. Because obviously this is an edited version of the serious amount of research that I did. So if there's a really specific area you want to know more information about, I probably got a lot more sources and bits of information for you that aren't in the presentation. So there's some really, really, really good articles from the Chartered College of Teaching about memory and about the use of knowledge organisers and why they're important and the pitfalls and how to do that and how to make them appropriate for SEND as well, which is really useful. But also, so yeah, if you wanted to do that instead, then that's absolutely fine. If you wanted to ask about any specific part of the research, then I'm more than happy to do that. I'm more than happy to talk to people as well.
That's brilliant, Suzi. That's ever so kind of you. There's been a couple of questions about the PowerPoint slides and also whether you get a certificate. So the PowerPoint slides will be uploaded to the website, and you'll get a link to that tomorrow or maybe the next day, along with the video recording if you wanted to watch it again. And with the certificate, once you've completed the evaluation, you will receive a link to a downloadable certificate, so you'll be able to get that. So we've got one question here, actually, Suzi, about the food and nutrition side of things and ways to engage children more better. You did talk about that quite a lot in your first presentation, I think, didn't you? So that was a lot about settling children down and sort of behaviour in the classroom, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, like I said, there's sort of two camps to this research. The first presentation really goes through how you support students with their regulation and getting them into the classroom and getting them settled. And that might be a place to start, but by all means, shoot me an email if there's anything else that you sort of wanted to talk about. I think it's definitely making sure that students feel, I think with food and nutrition, we're really lucky that there's a lot of them that really want to be in that classroom because they want to cook. But I think sometimes it's a struggle to get the theory in. And I think that's something that, they then sort of start to switch off on. So I think some of those strategies might be really helpful for theory lessons. But by all means, shoot me an email if there's anything else.
Right. I'm thinking it might be a blog, Suzi. So I'll be in touch.
Okay. Love that.
Right. Okay. So one final question, which I think will really round it off. Have you got one top tip for food teachers?
I think it's about when you're in, and this is hard to do because there are so many things going on in a food practical, and we know that. But I think wherever you can, really try to connect, because the food practicals are things that really engage and drive students, I think, for food. Can find ways of really using the time in those lessons to connect things together. So even when you're doing a demonstration, okay, we're chopping an onion today. What other things have we chopped that are the same? How do we approach this? Is it what grip am I using? When else have we used that? So to really just try and connect wherever you can in that practical time. So they're doing that almost autonomously, but also get them to record it. So later, is that to do with homework? Is that to do with the next lesson? So it's not just practical theory. They're bridging the gap between the two in terms of how can we make sure that we are recalling those practical skills that will take us through the curriculum, rather than just an evaluation of what our food tastes like or what it looked like or everything else. The skills throughout it, I think, are really important.
Great. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate it. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. And we look forward to you joining us in the new academic year for some more training. And particularly for Suzi, thank you so much. Really appreciate everything that you've done for us. So for presenting at the conference at the beginning of the year and then re-recording that and then joining us today and then potentially writing a blog for us. That's been great.
I've loved it, and thank you for putting up with fire alarms and computers not working. Evidently, they're all connected somehow.
That's great. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a good evening. Thanks a lot.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.